Yeah, this is good. Okay. So, I'm reviewing today the second volume in this double volume edition, the second book of Creigton's two biographies of John A. Macdonald, first Prime Minister of Canada. My first review, I reviewed The Young Politician, and in this video, I'm reviewing The Old Chieftain, published in 1955. Donald Creighton, University of Toronto, history professor, author, famous old school Canadian historian. I'm going to start by start as Creigton starts. Chapter 1. On Thursday afternoon, November 7, 1867, Macdonald, along with the other members of the Commons, stood waiting expectantly and somewhat nervously in the Senate chamber of the Parliament buildings at Ottawa. The Governor-General, Lord Monck, was reading the speech from the throne to the first federal Parliament of Canada. The legislative history of the new Dominion was about to commence. Outside, the season was far advanced in autumn. The day was fine. Most of the shops in town were shut. A great crowd had pressed behind the rows of regulars and militia which lined the carriage drive up to the great central door of the building, and inside in the Senate chamber the galleries were crowded with people. Behind the rows of senators, nearly 100 ladies, the wives and daughters of the members, gay in toilettes, watched the ceremony. And out in front, close to the Governor-General's chair, a little group of seats had been specially reserved for Lady Monck and the wives of the cabinet ministers. Susan Agnes, this is Macdonald's second wife, who he marries in 1867. Susan Agnes was prominent among them. For the first time in Macdonald's career, his wife was taking her appointed place in the ceremonial of Canadian politics. He noted appreciatively how much she seemed to enjoy such affairs and how instinctively expert she was at them. She was a tall woman, dark, with rather large but regular features and fine, serious eyes. Her grave, almost statuesque appearance, her poised, easy manner made her an appropriate part of the formal scene. Macdonald wore his court costume. He was 52 now, getting on to 53, but it was difficult to see his age and his tall, slight, erect figure in the easy nonchalance of his pose. The crested wave of his black hair had subsided only a little. The skin of his oval face was still boyishly unlined, and his sardonic smile was as quick and genial as ever. He tired more quickly than he had done. Now, when he read, he liked to lie extended on a sofa, and after lunch he would often take a quick midday rest. Sometimes there was a weary pallor in his face that brought Agnes a sudden pang of fear, but he had remarkable powers of recovery. His spirits seemed as resilient and mercurial as ever. He can throw off a weight of business in a wonderfully short time, his wife confided to her diary. Oftentimes he comes in with a very moody brow, tired and oppressed, his voice weak, his step slow, and 10 minutes after he was making clever jokes and laughing like any schoolboy, with his hands in his pockets and his head thrown back. His high spirits were just as refreshing as they had been before. His good nature seemed to have lost none of its easygoing tolerance. So this is the beginning of the book in 1867 at the opening of the Parliament buildings. I didn't detail Confederation very much in the Young Politician because it's a large subject on its own, and I think I'm going to review Christopher Moore's 1867, How the Fathers Made a Deal. And let's see if you can see the famous painting there. There's Macdonald, prominent, but also all the faces. George Brown's in there somewhere, and all the faces are recognizable. But I'm going to review that separately and deal with Confederation separately. So what was going on in Canada in 1867 after the opening of the Parliament? The biggest thing on John Macdonald's mind at this point was the fact that Nova Scotia wanted to basically leave Confederation because they mostly never wanted in. But a little more on Macdonald's second wife. She was 20 years his junior. He married her when he was 52, and that would have made her 32. She was English, I believe. Anyways, he met her in London during the negotiations for the BNA Act that he was engaged in. So Nova Scotia was the violently unruly member of the Union. And the leader of Nova Scotia politics at this time was Joseph Howe. Macdonald called him that pestilent fellow Howe. But Howe was elected to the federal parliament, so he was there to cause trouble. And this was probably the most significant thing about the first parliament. It's interesting that Quebec, it was not considered in that same characterization as Nova Scotia at this time. And I have to say that I think the main reason for that is that the Quebec leaders leading up to Confederation, particularly Cartier, and I think most of them, basically, it's not that they really wanted Confederation, it's just that they thought it was better than being ruled from London. So that's why they were content with Confederation, although that has been a subject of discussion, to put it mildly, in Quebec ever since. But at this point, it's Nova Scotia that's not happy. So a little more on, I want to present some of the personal side of Macdonald. I didn't do that too much in the first book, but his wife is Anglican, but she increasingly becomes more evangelical Protestant and puritanical. That's kind of being a little harsh, but basically, if we remember, Johnny Macdonald was a drinker and guy who loved living the high life, socially speaking. And so her role, when she kind of gets settled in, she basically reforms the drinker Macdonald, but maybe only partially. So Macdonald is concerned with basically pacifying Nova Scotia in the first 2 years of Confederation. One violent event is the assassination of D'Arcy McGee, Irish-Canadian cabinet minister and prominent father of Confederation, I believe. Anyways, he was in the federal cabinet and was assassinated. Creigton tells the story of Macdonald being woken up in the middle of the night and McGee had been shot in the head in the street, I believe by Irish nationalists of some kind. I'm not too, I don't know too much about McGee's assassination, but quite a disturbing event, and it shows the seriousness both of Irish politics in Ireland, obviously, in the UK at this time, and in North America, both in the United States and Canada. There was the Fenian raids of Irish Americans into Canada, Canada being part of the British Empire. So this assassination of Magee shows us there's definitely a serious side to Canada at this time. So Western Canada had not been transferred or purchased, was not part of Canada at Confederation. It was 1869, and the transfer of Rupert's Land, that is the Hudson's Bay Company's nominal jurisdiction over present-day Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. And so the transfer, Canada was supposed to pay Britain, or the Hudson's Bay Company, I'm sure there was some arrangement there, a large sum in 1869, but Macdonald stops payment, which is a fairly big deal. Basically, what was going on was, particularly in Red River in Manitoba, obviously they didn't have any self-determination, and so understandably a lot of them weren't happy. Even the Hudson Bay Company employees, the factor or head of the forts, were not necessarily sympathetic to Canada taking over. And there was trouble there in Red River, and this was before the railway, so Macdonald couldn't do anything about it. So he basically postponed payment until representatives from the Canadian government could get over to Red River and assess the situation. He didn't want to bring troops over because he didn't want a big disaster right at the beginning. And so he held off payment, which was a big deal. The Hudson's Bay Company and the British government under Gladstone were not happy. So another big thing in Macdonald's life, as we recall, his first wife was an invalid confined to her bedroom for basically her entire relationship with Macdonald. I think a year or two after they were married, she got this chronic illness, and so he was always alone, which is why he drank to a large extent, more living the bachelor life, because he was on his own in Ottawa or Toronto or wherever the assembly was sitting. But he marries his new wife. He obviously has high hopes. She's a really different personality, more of a social person. But then she has their first child, and it's a horrendous birth on May 7th, 1869. And at this point, that's all they know. It was a horrendous birth, a long, drawn-out birth. But there's more on and his daughter Mary was born. But there's more on Mary shortly. So in 1869, Creigton looks back to Macdonald's past, and he says he drank more often when happy in his political, in his life up till this point. More, going out to the bar, smoking rooms in the 19th century, whatever, drinking with the boys. And I think they moved in, when he was first married to Agnes, they moved into his old apartment or townhouse in Ottawa, where he used to live as a bachelor with Galt, another father of Confederation. So it's interesting kind of personal scene to where he lived, and then he lived with his new wife in Ottawa. But Creigton grants that while he mostly drank socially, it was not completely so, as he had his bouts of drinking. There was a second, more serious habit or during which Macdonald drank, which was when he was trying to basically stave off depression or when something really bad was happening to him. So basically, his new daughter Mary has a serious deformity of her head and is mentally retarded in some way. And the realization of this, it's not apparent right when she's born, but as the baby's growing, this becomes apparent. So Macdonald was really a happy personality, but he got hammered. I mean, he had some pretty tough hands dealt to him. So he goes on a drinking bout. His debts also in 1869. He lapses into his old habits. So the West, the purchase of Rupert's land goes through. Now what to do? No railway. Very interesting. Macdonald's here shows empathy to the settlers of the Red River colony. Quote, he says it's not their fault that they're antagonistic. Nobody told them anything other than that they'd been sold to Canada. So here's the quote from Macdonald at this time. He says, quote, all these poor people know is that Canada has bought the country from the HBC and that they are handed over like a flock of sheep to us. That's in a letter to Cartier, 27 November 1869. So Macdonald is ensconced in his apartment with his new wife and their daughter, 1869. It says, on the night of December 1st, the very day on which the transfer of the money for Rupert's land was to have been effected, Macdonald sat in the upstairs dressing room of the Quadrilateral, that was his apartment or house in Ottawa, by the side of a blazing coal fire, tranquilly reading a troll-up novel. It's interesting that he's reading a troll-up novel. I think troll-up was more of the liberal stamp in England, but people will have to verify that. My education's not in English literature, so he's reading a troll-up novel. The house was very still. Early in the day it had turned sharply cold after a period of thaw and rain, and now the frost gripped the deserted streets outside in an icy stillness. Agnes was writing in her diary. Little Mary, who had not cried all day, was sleeping peacefully in her cot, and downstairs in the kitchen hall the servants were reading the papers by the kerosene light and gossiping quietly. His mind was more at ease than it had been for weeks. Barely a fortnight ago, the dreadful news of the trouble at Red River had burst in upon an unprepared Ottawa. But in the meantime he had taken the best means to vindicate the Canadian government and pacify the unrest. Above all, he had extricated Canada at the very last minute from the frightful responsibility that what was about to be unloaded upon her. From the frightful responsibility. December 1st might have been a day black with foreboding, but it was bright with a glad sense of release. Everything was not settled yet, of course. The Colonial Office in Britain had regarded Canada's refusal to complete its contract with astonishing disapproval. Granville had cabled to Sir John Young that in accordance with the terms of the Imperial Act, the transfer and the payment of the purchase price must legally follow the surrender of the territory. Government by Canada has become impossible, he wired. Government by Canada only alternative and ought to be established promptly. Oh, government by company has become impossible. Government by Canada only alternative and ought to be established promptly. And how could it possibly be established promptly, Macdonald demanded, with the Métis already resisting the peaceful entrance of MacDougall. A military expedition was out of the question in the depths of winter, and at the moment any assumption of authority by Canada that was not backed by force of arms would simply expose the weakness of the Dominion and invite the interference from the United States. I cannot understand, he wrote to John Rose, that was a friend of his in London, the desire of the Colonial Office or of the Company to saddle the responsibility of the Government of Canada just now. It would so completely throw the game into the hands of the insurgents and the Yankee wire pullers, who are to some extent influencing and directing the movement from St. Paul, that we cannot foresee the consequences. It was easily conceivable that the American government would decide to intervene. It was quite impossible that Canada would lose its inheritance in the Northwest. This is very likely at this point because there's no railway between Eastern Canada and Western Canada, the prairies, let alone BC. So, but accessing Manitoba and the prairies is much easier from the United States. So it's just sitting there, and the Canadian government has authority for it, but it's just a sitting duck for the Americans. This is so it's going to be interesting to see how that the prairie provinces actually successfully became part of Canada. But this is a major challenge, and it shows that the fear of the U.S. was a major factor in Confederation and in Western Canada becoming like the settlement of Western Canada. So at this point, Prime Minister Gladstone in Britain announces that the regular troops, British regulars, are being pulled out of central Canada at the same time. So Canada's having to step up here big time. But will it? And Macdonald writes to Lord Carnarvon, who was the colonial secretary that was really instrumental in getting Confederation completed. Macdonald writes, "We greatly distrust the men at the helm in England." So there's this dynamic of the Liberals in England. Gladstone was wanting to, get rid of the colonies, and Macdonald says he really distrusts Gladstone, whereas he probably would have liked Disraeli, and we'll hear more about Disraeli later. So they send out, the Canadian government sends a guy out to Red River, and this is a pretty big task he's got on his hands. But they send out Donald Smith, who was I think originally a Hudson's Bay Company fur trader, and I believe in Labrador, or not out west, but he was a lot of experience in the backwoods and experience with the Hudson's Bay Company. So they send him out to Red River, and he arrives December 27, 1869. So are they just going to shoot this guy or what? Very interesting. A large crowd hears him out. So we get a democratic sense here in Western Canada right at the beginning. A guy comes, he gives a speech to a crowd. This is very interesting. Probably to mostly Métis people. So a large crowd hears him out. The next day, a larger meeting sets a convention. So here they are setting up a democratic convention of English and French speakers, 20 representatives, I think, total of English and French speakers. And they present Smith with a list of rights. Very democratic culture, very, very interesting. Very Western Canadian, we'd have to say, right at the beginning here. But also really civilized. This was really impressive. So they compiled 2 lists to be presented to Macdonald. And they give this to Donald Smith. First, that the convention, first that of the convention, second by French members of the provisional executive alone. So Louis Riel had set up a French-speaking executive, and this was what was hanging in the air. Is he claiming sovereignty of Manitoba territory? And so there's 2 lists presented to Macdonald, one by this sort of democratic convention of French and English speakers, and then the second by this executive, Riel's executive. So the convention was not anxious for provincial status. I'm not sure what they wanted, but they were obviously pretty critical of Canada. They did not want provincial status. Riel's executive wanted a French-dominated province straight out. But I guess they wanted provincehood. They just wanted it French-dominated. So Western Canada is hanging in the balance here. Riel, 1869-70. So Riel, this is at some point here, this is the first Riel rebellion. So the Riel rebellion, 1869-1870, came during some severe health problems for John A. Macdonald's and the realization of his daughter's disability. So there's a lot going on here. And the Manitoba Democrats send down 3 delegates to Ottawa to negotiate with Macdonald. And he is overwhelmed. He hits the bottle. So there's a description. I believe this is the Governor General or a British representative writes to Disraeli and summarizes Macdonald's his more serious drinking habit. So this is Sir Stafford Northcote. He writes, quote, "His habit is," Northcote informed Disraeli, "to retire to bed, to exclude everybody, and to drink bottle after bottle of port. All the papers are sent to him, and he reads them, but he is conscious of his inability to do any important business, and he does none. He did none for at least 2 days." This is while the delegates are there. So he but he's far from beaten. That's putting it mildly. You could skip ahead a few decades here, and he's still going. So, Cartier, his partner in crime, literally in the Pacific scandal, but he's got a nice anti-American quote here from Cartier shows that the Quebec politicians had no love lost for the U.S. either, which is interesting. I'm not sure why. But so Cartier, like Macdonald, had been deeply suspicious of Allen, that's the railway robber baron, and his American connections. But he says in French, as long as I will live and I will be in the government, never a cursed American company will control the Canadian Pacific. So, interesting anti-American quote from Cartier. In all these speeches that were laid here, of course, the Americans are the favorite punching bag. So, the election of 1872, and this is where Macdonald gets into some illegal trouble. Or at least some political trouble. So Macdonald, Cartier, Langevin, during the 1872 election, take money for party use from companies bidding on the Transcontinental Railway. Yeah, the Pacific Scandal. I think did I relate about the Pacific Scandal in the first book? Was talking about that. Creigton discourses on the Pacific Scandal, and I related that at the outset, or a story of that, of a student of his relating Creigton discoursing on the Pacific Scandal during a graduate student seminar. And if you want a summary of the Pacific Scandal, maybe go watch the beginning of my first review of The Young Politician. But I gave just the kernel of the scandal there. So Cartier is defeated in the 1872 election. Macdonald said they'd acted together since 1854, never had a serious difference. Quite the statement. And the alliance of Macdonald with French Canadians was basically a pillar of his politics, and was why he was the only one. If he hadn't had that, he would have never got elected once. Like, they never would have won a majority ever. But so Cartier defeated, but they're still in power. The Pacific Scandal hasn't been revealed yet. So Macdonald, I related in The Young Politician, was an absolute master of parliamentary intricacies and plots, and the most famous being the double shuffle, which I related in my first video. But he's got a few. He's got definitely. I'll just relate. Give a sort of list of some of the tricks he used, had up his sleeve. So he had his nickname was Old Tomorrow. So one of his tricks was basically just to do nothing and hope that a second scandal would come along that would distract people from the scandal that he was originally being accused of. So that's not a bad idea. I wonder if Bill Clinton did the same thing. I think he probably did. But probably other politicians as well. He has this giving someone the rope with which to hang themselves. The double shuffle is sort of an example of that, and an incredibly high stakes example where he actually gives up power. I mean, it's just unprecedented. I don't think this has ever happened in British politics or Canadian politics since, but they actually give up power and go and sit on the opposition bench because Macdonald is gambling that they can't win a vote once they're the government, so he's going to get back in power. But he gives Brown the rope with which to hang himself. Ooh. But Macdonald was a smooth operator. There's still this predominantly local affiliation of MPs, there's free votes in the Parliament at this time, and people in Canada don't even know what this is anymore. But basically, the MPs voted the way they wanted more often, based on what they believed on a particular vote and what their local constituents thought. At least what I'm saying here is that the local affiliation was stronger at this time. This made debate in the House of Commons meaningful because you had to convince individual members to vote for a bill. This obviously raised the bar on democracy, and now we don't have any free votes, and everything's just the will of the prime minister is enforced upon the backbenchers. So this is not the case at this time in the House of Commons. So there's a Governor General who's really quite observant, and his letters back to the Colonial Office are real commentaries on Canadian politics and on Macdonald at this time. This is Lord Dufferin, and he has got Macdonald figured on some of his tricks. And he says, my impression is, Dufferin concluded shrewdly, that Macdonald is waiting to see whether the opponents of the measure will prove sufficiently strong to make it worth his while to enter into an alliance with them. So Macdonald, he would wait to see how circumstances developed. And this is referencing when he's been unceremoniously booted from the prime minister's job and is in opposition, and but that comment applies to him generally, or throughout his career. It is trait of waiting. So here Macdonald shows an incredible knowledge of contemporary current affairs, political ideology. Here in this example, he's talking about ultramontanism in Europe and its effect on Quebec politics. How about that? So ultramontanism was conservative Catholicism, I believe. So mind you, Macdonald wrote shrewdly, showing more knowledge of European affairs and Roman Catholic politics than Galt, Galt, the father of Confederation, would ever take the trouble to acquire. This is Macdonald writing. Ultramontanism depends on the life of two old men, the Pope and Bishop Bourget in Canada. Now, there can be no doubt that there is an agreement between Catholic powers that the next Pope shall not be ultramontane. In fact, it is absolutely necessary for Europe that he should be a liberal Catholic who will cure the split in the church and bring back the old Catholics to the fold. So he is up on European politics to the extent that he's aware of these different factions electing the new Pope and how this is going to affect politics in Quebec. Holy smoke. He was extremely well read, both in literature and current affairs, as we can see here. He calls the imperial connection with Britain, quote, the cardinal point in our policy, unquote. he saw Canada and Britain as allies. And the empire primarily is a group of allied nations. So the Pacific Scandal, the government is forced out of office. The Conservative MPs begin to desert, and the Governor General calls an election, and the Liberals trounce Macdonald. So Macdonald's in opposition now, and there was talk of him retiring at this point, but basically his party didn't want him to retire. I'll just summarize it as that. But so he's sitting in opposition. He's eating humble pie after having been busted for his dastardly deeds with taking money from the railway companies that were bidding on his government's contract for the Pacific Railway. So of course there's dirt everywhere, and legitimately so. It's not that he wasn't actually involved in this; he was. But he got the Canadian people humbled him, and along with Tupper and all of his other cabinet ministers, he gets booted. So he's sitting in opposition. And Alexander Mackenzie is the Liberal Prime Minister. So a lot happens during the Liberal term. Of course, the whole situation with the Riel rebellion and the entire all of Western Canada is, gets turned over into the Liberals' lap. So it's sort of a dubious, reward that they got, but that's democratic politics for you. And a few significant events that occur during the Liberal government, just generally in terms of Canadian history, the main treaties on the prairies with the native peoples were signed during the Liberal government's term. This is something a lot of people don't remember, but Treaty 7 and Treaty 7 with the Blackfoot, which basically covers all of southern and central Alberta, was signed during the Liberal government, as was Treaty 6 with the Cree covering most of central Alberta and central Saskatchewan. So big doings going on during the Liberal government, and Macdonald's in opposition. Macdonald knows Shakespeare well enough to quote a reference of a minor character in Henry IV. He quotes Pistol, and I think Pistol was a rogue character, which is probably telling of Macdonald. And you have to say the discourse of a guy like Macdonald and all the politicians, they a lot of them were like this. Their knowledge of literature is just, like it's on a way higher level than unfortunately the politicians today. So Macdonald's in opposition, and he's obviously eyeing every move that the Liberals make. And it's during this time in opposition that he begins to hear rumblings in primarily, I think, in Ontario, of a desire for protectionism. And so this is the beginnings of one of Macdonald's the policies he's most associated with, which is the national policy, or the tariff. economic protectionism. But he wasn't like a doctrinaire protectionist. At this point, he is looking for anything that can give him an edge over the liberals. And he thinks that there's rumblings even within the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party was definitely stood for free trade in the 19th century in Britain and in Canada. But he hears rumblings even within the Liberal ranks of desire for protection for Ontario industrial, factories, etc. And so this enters his mental horizon. And simultaneously, he starts a new sort of political habit. He, up until this now, or 1776, he was more of the, he didn't campaign like, Macdonald states here that he considered, in his first part of his career, the habit of stumping, of giving stump speeches all over his constituency or all over a province was sort of an American practice. That he didn't do that up until this 1876 period. But they start this new political phenomenon, the political picnic. This is primarily in Ontario, but we're talking about 15,000 people in Barrie. That might be one of the biggest, or once the phenomenon got going. But we got 5,000 in Colborne, Ontario. We've got some quotes from this period. So Macdonald starts to hit his stride after having been floored during the Pacific scandal. So it was 11 o'clock when the train reached Uxbridge, Ontario. During the last hour of the journey, the sky had become perceptibly more threatening, and shortly after the arrival, a little light rain fell. This was certainly discouraging. It promised badly for the main events of the afternoon, but it did not spoil the roaring enthusiasm of Macdonald's reception. Two brass bands, one had come up from Markham, crashed into a march tune, and before the station platform was a wide semicircle of waiting and applauding people. The president of the Liberal Conservative Association of Ontario, Macdonald's party is still called the Liberal-Conservative Party. The president of the Liberal Conservative Association of Ontario North read a welcome address. Macdonald replied gracefully for himself and the other guests, and then they all got into carriages, and the procession, with the band at its head, moved slowly through the streets under triumphal arches which shouted welcome and promised victory. It was over half an hour before they reached the grove at the other side of the village. This is like a procession of a king or something, where the picnic was to be held. There, under the tall elms, long tables, crisp with newly ironed cloths, had been laid out for those serious picnickers who, despite the weather, had come determined to lunch in a genteel fashion al fresco, rather than in the steaming dining rooms of the hotels. The tables were loaded with all the substantials and delicacies of a hearty meal, with plates of cold sliced chicken, ornamented tongues, hams, Milan soufflés, red mounds of strawberries, elaborate molds of flummery and charlotte russe, tipsy cakes, pound cakes, piles of tea and cheesecakes, great misted jugs of iced lemonade and raspberry cordial, and clusters of bottles of wine. Wow, this sounds tasty. It was high noon. Before the speeches, the main event of the occasion, were scheduled to begin. There was to be a lunch interval of at least an hour. Macdonald lunched and passed from table to table and threaded his way from group to group and gossiped, shook hands and acknowledged introductions and welcomed uproarious salutes. These were the Canadians. They had come in an amiable holiday mood to relax and chatter, to see each other, but above all to see him. They had dressed themselves in their best for a memorable occasion, at once serious and entertaining, and they greeted him with a curious mixture of awe as for a reigning monarch, and joyous familiarity as a beloved friend. It was a slice of the community, a cross-section of the nation, a sample of town and village and countryside. By this time, it was after 1:30. He climbed the fresh pine steps of the temporary platform, crowded already with speakers, officials, and their ladies. Before him was a crowd of several thousand people, good-humoured, expectant people who reclined on the grass or sat on the insufficiently numerous chairs which the Conservative Association had provided, and waited for the instruction and the entertainment of the afternoon. There were several acres of hats, silk top hats, small close-fitting feminine hats with feathers draped modishly between the curls and ringlets, old-fashioned brightly covered sunbonnets, curly bowlers, straw boaters, and here and there, like other enormously expanded hats, provident umbrellas and fringed pink parasols. This is a very Victorian scene. As he watched the crowd and listened to the long succession of introductory speeches, Macdonald glanced occasionally and surreptitiously at the grey sky. He was at his best. Well, first of all, Tupper, this is Charles Tupper, the cabinet minister, father of Confederation, gives a rousing speech. When he's done, Macdonald steps to the stage. So Macdonald was at his best. Easy, conversational, discursive. He made some jokes. He told a few stories. He accepted occasional interruptions readily, and as if they had been expected cues. His plan, if he had one, seemed infinitely flexible. His manner amiable and rambling. Yet hidden beneath the jocular good humour of the speech was a clear and aggressive purpose. Every word was designed to put the Liberals on the defensive. The Liberals, he told his listeners, were still harping upon the extinct issue of the Pacific scandal, with the obvious purpose of disguising the simple fact that it was their government that was on trial. The weakness and ineptitude of the Mackenzie administration had been exposed by many tests, but its incapacity had been revealed above all by the challenge of the Depression and the mere presence of a few protectionists among the reformers, capital R reformers, should not obscure the government's refusal to accept its economic responsibilities. The great question now before the country, Macdonald insisted, was as to the best means to relieve it of the existing commercial depression, and there was no use looking to Mr. Mackenzie because he was a free trader. So Macdonald's hinting at his new policy, which he's going to focus on to try to oust the Liberals. The picnic had been an unqualified success, but what was far more important, it had been a huge political triumph, as the by-elections of July 5th quickly demonstrated. So the Conservatives win 2 by-elections, and this bodes well for the upcoming election. So he goes down to Toronto to the United Empire Club, another gigantic procession and celebration. This isn't even an election campaign. This is just in between elections. There's a buzz in the air. Macdonald's getting back in the saddle after having disgraced himself with the Pacific scandal. Everywhere there was a sharp realization that fortune, who was always unpredictable and who for a long time had been bafflingly unrevealing, had at length and decisively made up her mind. Macdonald had found his theme, the relief of the Depression through a change in fiscal policy. He had discovered his method, the political picnic. All over the province, the Liberal Conservatives were suddenly alerted like soldiers who had been roused to action or jobless men fired by the prospect of employment. For over 2 years they had been sunk in apathetic discouragement. Now they were aroused and hopeful. They had a cause and a way of promoting it. So this gives a slice of Creigton's writing. 10,000 people at a Toronto meeting. 10,000 people, and I guess this is May 1877. I don't even think that's in the election yet either. He's getting 10,000 people at a meeting in between elections. 50,000 people at Montreal's Dominion Square, June 1877. This is a completely different world. I don't even recognize this, but it's amazing. I think, yeah. So let's see here. Macdonald carried the war aggressively into the last session of the Third Parliament. It was, appropriately enough, a tense and angry period in international affairs. Once again, 20 years after the Crimean War, Great Britain faced the real possibility of becoming involved in the quarrels of Russia and Turkey. Sounds current. Late in January 1878, Disraeli ordered the Mediterranean fleet to steam through the straits to Constantinople. In England, there was an immense popular support for this armed defiance of the advancing Russian armies, and for some weeks a fight on a very large scale seemed possible. Canada, which now had a coastline on 2 oceans, was very much more conscious of its alarming proximity to this huge northern country. I find that hard to believe that they were thinking about Russia and central Canada at this time, but maybe. In June, when the Congress of Berlin met to make a settlement of the affairs of southeastern Europe, the agitation suddenly subsided, but it had been the first serious international crisis which Canada had experienced since Confederation. It had stirred many people. It deeply affected Macdonald. He founded permanent Canadian Army. Yada yada yada. So he says to Sir Stafford Northcote, and yet I am satisfied that the time has come for the formation of a regular force closely connected with the Imperial Army and worked up to the same standard of training and discipline. Without this, Canada will never add to the strength of the Empire, but must remain a source of anxiety and weakness. So Macdonald definitely had big thoughts. It was not parochial. And this is a theme with Macdonald. His easygoing urbanity. So the opposite of parochial, urbane. That's Creigton's phrase, quote, his easygoing urbanity, unquote. So Macdonald and the Liberal Conservatives win the election of 1878 on basically the national policy. Well, anyways, that was one of his main planks. So Macdonald took the portfolio of the Minister of the Interior, and this has implications for his the things he did with respect to the native peoples in Western Canada. He takes the portfolio of the Minister of the Interior, a relatively new portfolio created in 1873. So this ministry was created by the Liberals. I believe the Liberals passed the Indian Act too, but I'll have to go back and check that. But Macdonald takes his portfolio. It was invested with all the important aspects of Canada's program of expansion in the West. So he considered this important. He takes it for himself. There's quite a handful here. So as late as April 1877, Macdonald had admitted frankly that he knew little about the provisions of the Dominion Lands Act of 1872. So this is something we have to take Macdonald on his own terms, be empathetic, put ourselves in his shoes. What kind of personality was he? He was a bon vivant, hard-drinking, easygoing kind of guy. And he just says, frankly, I don't know much about Western Canada. And yet he's Prime Minister, and he's claiming this gigantic territory. It's astonishing. So the Dominion, he says he doesn't know much about the Dominion Lands Act of 1872, which was the legal framework for settlement. So he's undoubtedly unfamiliar with the details of the Department of the Interior, and he can be criticized for this. This is major implications for the native peoples, and like this is a time of transition, and so he can be criticized for this. But as for whether he's malicious in this, I find that hard to believe. It's more that he apparently didn't know much about Western Canada. Maybe he should have taken it more seriously. But on the other hand, there's a lot of we're only getting going here, and there's some extenuating, gigantic facts here that we will relate. He's 63 years old in 1878. So the new Governor General's wife is the daughter of Queen Victoria. So this is in 1878, the new Governor General, the Marquis of Lorne, which shows Canada was becoming more respectable. I don't think they would have sent the Queen's daughter out to Canada, when Tecumseh was... Tecumseh fought with the British, but still. But here, Canada's a little bit more, at least central Canada, a little bit more respectable here. It's at least less dangerous anyways. So Lord Dufferin, the outgoing Governor General, says, quote, Sir John is a thorough man of the world, unquote. Creigton goes on. He says, Lord Kimberley had placed Macdonald in the 18th century. Quote from Lord Kimberley, he should have lived in the good old times of the two bottle men. So Creigton goes on, Kimberley had placed him in the 18th century, to the age which had closed in 1832 with the passage of the Reform Bill. He had, this is Macdonald, its grace, its urbanity, its intelligence and reasonableness, and its freedom from sanctimoniousness. So he's not really Victorian. He's more 18th century. A hard-drinking, devil-may-care kind of guy. He's not the moralist of the 19th century and the Victorian period, which is why his opponents hated him, because he was a rogue, and yet he kept winning everything. So this is who Macdonald is. Dufferin notes also his, quote, great faculty for managing people. People liked Macdonald. Even his opponents liked him. There's that anecdote I related from the young politician, where Macdonald weaves this tale about the younger Pitt, and basically ends up insulting his opponent in this extremely elaborate way. And the guy, the reform or liberal, I believe the premier at that time, or a cabinet minister, says, frankly, I enjoyed that entire intricate tale you just told there, but it makes me look like a monster, but it was entertaining. So even his opponents liked him, and he had this. He really he would remember people, individuals. Like there's a story related, I think, in another. I don't think this is in Creigton, but he meets a guy in Vancouver in 1880. Something after he finally gets across the, Canada on the CPR. We're a long ways away from that here, and he's in Vancouver, and he meets some guy, and he instantly recognizes him from a picnic in the 1860s or 1870s, and the guy was amazed that he remembered him. But this is who Macdonald was. He knew every member of his caucus like the back of his hand. He knew many of the opposition politicians for long periods of time, and he had this, what Dufferin calls his great faculty for managing people. This has got to be one of the main factors in his political success, because the other people in your party have to like you. Otherwise, you ain't going to stay at the top. And Macdonald certainly stayed at the top for decades and decades. So Creigton says he had the shameless adoption of the mental habits of the last person he spoke to. So this is another little quirk of Macdonald's. Shameless adoption of the mental habits of the last person he spoke to. That's really funny. So his entire personality infuriated doctrinaire people, hardliners, ideologues, this kind of thing, because he didn't really care. He was more of a bon vivant, and that's who Macdonald was. Of course, this obliterates our 21st century. I have to say, I was going to use an insulting word, but this either-or American Republican Democrat conservative liberal thing, this means nothing here, because this hard-drinking guy who's drunk all the time, he's the leader of the Liberal Conservative Party. We have to take people on their own terms. The terms don't mean much into what we have, these terms that we use today, and we should know the history of what these terms mean in the 19th century. But I don't think Macdonald would have taken a hard stand on any ideology, although he did care about certain things, but I don't think he was much of an ideologue. For example, the national policy, one of the things he's mainly known for in history, he didn't always think that way. He just thought it would oust the liberals, and so he adopted it. I mean, and that appears to be what Creigton's saying here. So, Macdonald might have been the ghost of a lean, hard-drinking 18th century squire, unquote. It's from Creigton. Quote, he looked with skeptical tolerance upon the imperfection of humanity and the limitations of government. In different circumstances, Macdonald might have believed merely that the state should keep the peace and protect the frontiers, minimal government, and to all projects of further governmental intervention, he might have said with Lord Melbourne, why can't you just leave it alone? Wish we had more politicians like that. I don't care which party they were from. Lord Melbourne was a liberal in Britain. So, this is not... People are probably getting the much more free-floating culture at the time here. Although that didn't mean that they didn't go after their opponents strongly. Just you wonder if half of it was tongue-in-cheek. The railway, once finished, so now we're getting into the CPRs coming over the horizon here. The railway, once finished, we will become one great united country with a large interprovincial trade and common interest. This is Macdonald speaking. No income tax at this time. Income tax considered impossible in a country where money needed. Hello, politicians? You hear that one? Dubious sincerity on tariff, yes. Dubious sincerity on most things, frankly. So, dining at the Colonial Secretary's in London, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, sorry I massacred that one, in 1879, Macdonald said the tariff had been framed entirely to obtain revenue and to stop inundation of U.S. imports. So he's giving us slightly more respectable uh, motives here for the national policy. So he's in London and he visits with Disraeli. This is 1879. He goes out to Disraeli's country house. Beaconsfield, that's Disraeli, Lord Beaconsfield, was an old man. He had gone off very soon after the session ended to rusticate quietly in his country house, Hughenden Manor. And I'll relate that there's a small town in east central Alberta called Hughenden, obviously named after Disraeli's country house. And it was a new sensation in British prime ministers, he still felt a sense of obligation to pay some attention to, quote, the Canadian chief. The Queen regrettably had not invited Macdonald to stay to dinner at Osborne the day he had been made a Privy Councillor. All the great houses in town were shut. The Salisburys were away at Dieppe. Quote, "This vexes me," Beaconsfield wrote in embarrassment to Lord Lorne, "as I feel your ministers ought to have been festivaled and banqueted, but what are we to do with guests who will visit London in August?" There was only one thing to do, and he knew it. He invited Macdonald to come to Hughenden, and Macdonald delightedly accepted. Hughenden Manor lay in the Chiltern Hills, close to the market town of High Wycombe. Macdonald travelled down by the late afternoon train on Monday, September 1st, and Lord Beaconsfield's carriage was waiting for him at the Great Western Railway station. Hughenden stood on a high ground overlooking its own park and a small church and churchyard. Yeah, you know you've arrived when you have your own private church and churchyard. Built in the 1780s, with clean lines, sparse ornamentation, and pleasantly spaced sashed windows. Yada, yada, yada. Its single peculiarity then was that it was built of red brick and blue headers. But Disraeli was an ardent follower of the fashionable Gothic revival, and at his orders the property had been altered, yada, yada, yada. And a small, rather ugly dining room where Macdonald dined alone with his Disraeli and his young secretary. Daily. After dinner, they climbed the stairs to the smoking room. Very Victorian here. Which was a kind of auxiliary library on the top floor of the house, and there they talked until well after midnight. Disraeli said, quote, he is gentlemanlike, agreeable and very intelligent, a considerable man, unquote. It was not a bad tribute for one veteran to another. Would have been an interesting conversation. Wish we had a transcript of that conversation. You know, it is better to wear out than to rust out. I don't know if Macdonald said that, but he definitely lived this way. So he's getting on 65. So the railway. This is round 2 for Macdonald on the railway. Of course, in 1872, there was a Pacific scandal where he got busted with this, what was Allen's name? Sir George Allen? It was the dastardly robber baron. Oh yeah, Sir Hugh Allen. So this is a railway magnate who bribed Macdonald basically back in 1872. That all fell through. That company didn't probably lay a single rail. But 8 years later, Macdonald's back at it, promoting, trying to raise money in London. So, yeah, well, so the financial stage we're going to look at here at this point, because this is the international financial stage. Canada's trying to raise money, and nobody wants anything to do with it. The Anglo-Canadian alliance, which was the basis of Canada's independence in North America, was still effective in politics, but in finance at this stage it exerted little force. The polite indifference to Canada which under the Gladstone regime ruled at Whitehall was translated in the city, that's the London capital city, in a cold and critical suspicion of Canadian enterprises. No pun intended. No important British financial house gave the project the slightest support or encouragement at the beginning, and at least one company, the Grand Trunk, which had its headquarters in London, maintained an unrelenting opposition for years to come. The great centres of English-speaking finance, London and New York, were either indifferent or hostile to the Canadian Pacific. The press of England and the United States varied in its attitude between contemptuous neglect and active malevolence. The Times, which had not even troubled to consider the employment of a correspondent at Ottawa, exhibited a sneering indifference and superciliousness to all things Canadian, which surprised and shocked Lord Lorne. The American press associations, as their record amply proved, had never missed a chance of minimizing Canada's achievements and exaggerating its troubles and difficulties. Although we have to remember that this is a very Toronto perspective, Creigton being University of Toronto professor, but we'll take him at his word here. I don't know how much the Americans paid any attention at all, but anyways, they wouldn't give the Canadian government any money or any Canadian railway company. So Macdonald's getting bogged down. Now a man enters the stage here who was to be a major figure in the rest of Macdonald's life. That's George Stephen, the eventual president of the CPR. Anyways, major shareholder, and along with Donald Smith, who him and Macdonald bury the hatchet because, well, I'll talk about that later. But the guy that he had sent out to Winnipeg basically abandoned him during the Pacific scandal and was sitting. He was a member of the Liberal government, but him and Macdonald bury the hatchet. And George Stephen enters the stage. So George Stephen. So it was at this point that George Stephen re-entered his affairs. He had, of course, known George Stephen before. He had known George Stephen for the sufficient reason that he knew everybody of any real importance in the business world of Canada. And George Stephen was undeniably important. So he came from Scotland in 1850, worked his way up in business, and became the president of the Bank of Montreal in 1876. So it looks like when he was 47 years old. Stephen worked his way up to become the president of the Bank of Montreal. He was a tall, thin man with a long oval head, sunk slightly forward on his chest, a pair of deep-set, brooding eyes, and a thick beard and drooping mustaches which seemed to emphasize his melancholic and watchful air of reflection. Nobody could doubt his financial sobriety and wisdom. He would not otherwise have been made president of the Bank of Montreal. But at the same time, his prestige was not founded solely on a sober record of prudence, probity, and hard work. There was about him an air of distinction which was apparent not only in externals, but also inwardly in the imaginative daring and originality of his mind. He trusted to his first illuminating impressions. He relied upon his insights. He had courage, resolution, and unflagging enterprise. He had a sense of the present and an eye for the future. He's definitely a big personality. Departure of Macdonald's friend John Rose had left a gap in the circle of Macdonald's commercial or mercantile friendships, but George Stephen was not destined immediately to fill it. Macdonald got to know him well, though not with any affectionate intimacy, and their acquaintanceship, an agreeable and intellectually stimulating association, continued uneventfully until it began to be affected in various curious ways by another relationship, a close family relationship of Stephen's, Donald A. Smith, the Hudson's Bay Company officer who had gone up to the Red River Colony in 1869 and who in 1873 had abandoned Macdonald in the final crisis of the Pacific scandal, was first cousin of George Stephen. The family connection, as always in Scottish households, was strong, but it was not the only tie which drew Smith and Stevens together. They had become good friends and close business associates. They prospered together and not unequally. The knowledge and experience of the one complemented those of the other. Stevens' main interest lay in the St. Lawrence Valley, Smith's beyond Lake Superior, and it was Smith who performed the crucially important office of awakening Stevens' interest in both the railway and in the Northwest. So we're getting the leading figures of the CPR here. Savage and persistent liberal opposition to the CPR contract. Canadian Pacific Bill, 1880. Liberals, just imagine, the first round, Macdonald had barely escaped prison, and then he's back in power, and he's wheeling and dealing with the world of high finance. Must have been trying. The Liberals politicians must have hated him. So February 1st, 1881, the CPR bill finally rammed through the Canadian Parliament. Macdonald's weary. He says, quote, "I have no pleasure nowadays but in work, and so it will be unto the end of the chapter," he wrote to Alexander Campbell, 12 July 1880. He's sick again. Convalesces in England. Tupper is fills Macdonald's role while Macdonald is convalescing over in England. Must have been a serious illness. There were several serious bouts. I believe he had gallstones that were really painful. But then there was serious illnesses. So Macdonald's got an insightful quote on Gladstone here. Macdonald said or wrote, quote, "Gladstone, if I read him aright, is governed by his hates and is as spiteful as a monkey," unquote. That's 1882. Macdonald in a letter to Galt. So Macdonald's surviving son from his first marriage, Hugh Macdonald, became a young lawyer like his father, joined the firm in Toronto. Macdonald's firm from Kingston had moved its office to Toronto, and he had a mind of his own. He married someone who John A. didn't agree with, but he was respectful to his father, but he basically said, "I'm going to do what I want." And Hugh and his wife and small daughter moved to Winnipeg in 1882. So let's sort of a vote of confidence in Winnipeg. I believe Hugh was also in some of the later military forays during the Second Riel Rebellion, I believe. So definitely interesting guy, his son. Conservatives won the election of 1882 in every province except Manitoba. Manitoba is unconvinced, to put it mildly. The basic determining difference of the positivity of Macdonald and the negativity of Blake, the Liberal leader. William Blake, and I confusedly, I think, said in my first video that Blake's father was the one who Macdonald challenged to a duel back in the old days. I mistakenly said it was that same man who all these years later was debating Macdonald in the House of Commons, but no, that this is his son, William Blake, the leader of the Liberal Party, who was a gifted lawyer, and was one of Macdonald's most formidable rivals after the exit of George Brown, who Brown never sat in the Canadian House of Commons. He was still involved in the Reform Liberal Party and still at least involved or owner of the Globe newspaper in Toronto. And I'm just going to drop a reference to my next review, which is going to be the double biography of George Brown by another old school titan, JMS Careless. Careless wrote a biography of George Brown called George Brown of the Globe. I'm going to review those next. As you can probably tell, I find this whole period fascinating. Such a democratic culture. It's really incredible. I seem to like George Brown just as much as I like Macdonald, although they're different personalities, and I'm really interested to read those biographies of Brown. But Brown is in the Senate, and Blake is Macdonald's new rival. 1883, Macdonald's ill again, decided to relinquish the portfolio of the Department of the Interior. So 1883, he relinquishes that department, but he keeps for himself superintendents of Indian Affairs and the Northwest Mounted Police. Now, I'm just going to take those facts and what can we gather from these facts? Macdonald admitted not to know much about Western Canada when he took the Department of the Interior, but he keeps for himself superintendents of Indian Affairs and the Mounted Police. Now, I've read a boatload of primary sources from Western Canada, that is the Prairie Provinces, from the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is the formation of the Northwest Mounted Police was a major fact, like in favor of Macdonald. This is I wrote a book. I encourage everybody to visit Amazon and purchase this. This is the flag of the Northwest, or the RCMP here. But I know that this history of the Northwest Mounted Police really well because I've read a lot of the primary sources. And Macdonald was the force behind it, no pun intended. And this is something nobody remembers, is that Macdonald created the Northwest Mounted Police and sent them out west to boot out the Americans. And they did that. In fact, most of the Americans actually just left before they arrived. And it was the dregs of American society. This is not a comment on all Americans, for heaven's sake, then or let alone now. But at that time, this was after the U.S. Civil War, and a lot of the roughest characters went up the Missouri River, and the roughest of them went north of the border where there was no law, and they were selling the native peoples what was basically poison that they called whiskey, and that there would have been a genocide of the Blackfoot if Macdonald had not organized and sent the Northwest Mounted Police. And nobody remembers this. I of course, you're not going to get much critical material of Macdonald in Creigton. Creigton is dealing in facts, in primary sources. He just relates information for the most part. But we can have I'm going to discuss whether he can be criticized, Creigton, for leaving out things. I think that's a fair criticism of Creigton, but this is not a criticism of Macdonald. For example, Creigton does not mention anything about the Northwest Mounted Police. He doesn't mention anything about Treaty 7, Treaty 6. These are major, milestones in the history of Western Canada, and Creigton doesn't really mention them at all. So, but this is not saying anything. I think Macdonald cared more about Western Canada than Creigton does. So we have to make this distinction. Here, Macdonald retains superintendents of Indian Affairs and the Mounted Police. Now, later in the final chapter, or near the final chapter, Creigton relates describes Macdonald's trip all the way over to Vancouver and Victoria, and he stops at the Blackfoot Reserve east of Calgary and meets Crowfoot. So I'm going to read about that, but I think this is a fair criticism of Creigton, is that it's a very Central Canadian perspective, and maybe Creigton can't be blamed for that either. So George Stephen was a financial genius, and he sure had to be, because he bitten off a lot by taking on the contract to build the CPR from Central Canada to Vancouver. He's got a whole bunch of financial shenanigans to get the railway built. So he had a plan to secure total 5% dividend for 10 years on CPR common stock. Maybe a little optimistic, over-optimistic. This is 1883. But this Stephen was trying to buoy the stock by government dividend guarantee of 3%. So there's there's a book by Lords of the Line I highly recommend on the building of the CPR. And quite frankly, the level of financial knowledge on the part of politicians at this time, I think it was Francis Hincks who cynically said that my politics now are all railroads now. So that's not to say maybe it wasn't a good thing, but they were up to their neck in the financial system and corporations, the stock market. This is Macdonald and Stephen, and it was not collusion. There was a contract between the CPR and the Canadian government. They were in constant communication. Stephen Macdonald, Donald Smith, who became another major. He was one of the main shareholders also of the CPR. It wasn't collusion. They pulled every trick in the book to get the CPR built, whether it was moral, immoral, borderline illegal. They did it. So there was a danger of the debasement of the Bank of Montreal stock. Now, Macdonald makes some comments on speculators, land sharks out in Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan and Alberta having not been, weren't provinces yet. It was the Northwest Territories. But so Macdonald, under no delusions regarding speculation and speculators in Manitoba and in the Northwest, he wrote to Lord Lorne calling, quote, public opinion in Manitoba a, quote, a ring of land sharks and homestead jumpers and a gang of speculators. Not too complimentary to Manitoba at this point, but no, Macdonald called a spade a spade. Sorry, gotta get some caffeine in me here. So what a mess is my comment. People in the 21st century have taken to judging all of these people. Well, let's see you build a railway from central Canada to Vancouver. I mean, the idea that all these people were angels is absurd, especially Macdonald. The fact was that Western Canada would have become part of the U.S., certainly. The fact that it became successfully part of Canada is really was not done by a bunch of angels, that's for sure. And maybe they can be criticized for that, or maybe not. We can have that discussion, but at the time, Macdonald, he's critical of the speculation. So did Macdonald have scruples? Did he have scruples? I'm going to think about that. But here he's calling Manitoba public opinion. So he's saying not even just the actual speculators. He says all of public opinion in Manitoba is a ring of land sharks and homestead jumpers, a gang of speculators. And there's evidence too that he was concerned that the Métis were being used to basically the land speculators in Manitoba were using people. Macdonald's concern for the portfolio was, this is a factor. He was concerned with the Métis and the native people being ripped off by the land sharks. But we'll have to delve in more into the primary sources on that. I'm just getting that sense here. There's also gigantic things going on with the provinces because confederation's a new thing, and the relationship between the provinces and the federal government is a new thing. And so there's tension, especially with Ontario. And the federal government at this time, and it's in the BNA Act that the federal government has the power to disallow provincial bills, but now I think that the provinces could appeal that to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure, but the federal government never does that today. When do they ever do that today? But here, Macdonald's federal government disallows major Ontario bills. So there's major fights for power with the provinces. And Macdonald is, with his fingerprints all over the BNA Act, he is an advocate of a strong federal government vis-a-vis the provinces, and that's found in the division of powers in the BNA Act. In Canada, are stronger to the federal government vis-a-vis the provinces than the federal government in the states vis-a-vis the states. In Canada, Macdonald put his foot down because he was afraid that Canada would be torn apart, that the strength of the provinces would be too strong. And we have to remember that the BNA Act was written during the American Civil War, which Macdonald and a lot of politicians in Canada interpreted as the failure of giving the states too much power. So in Canada, and Macdonald was an advocate of a strong federal government. So he disallows Ontario bills. So there's a change of sentiment in Britain regarding the empire circa 1884. Formation of the Imperial Federation League, which includes some liberals. So Macdonald is feted on a visit to England in 1884 by both conservatives and liberals. I think his new respectability was because the CPR started to be seen as actually something that was possible. And so he was starting to get credit for this, although it wasn't finished yet, because who was not finished? Riel. Riel returns to Western Canada. You know, he had been unceremoniously booted across the border after the first Riel rebellion, but he returns, and this means trouble. So second round with Riel, there's some damning evidence here that Creigton relates that the second Riel rebellion, Riel was looking out for numero uno. Now I make that statement, but this has big implications for Macdonald's reaction to the second Riel rebellion. So basically the interviews are conducted with Riel by I believe Roman Catholic priests and one of the lieutenant governor of the Northwest Territories, or representatives of these people, conduct interviews with Riel and learn what his terms are, what he wants. And what he wants is money for himself. And this is in the primary sources. Now, he's also got a scheme, Riel. He wants the entire Northwest Territories assigned a value of 40 cents an acre to be divided 25 cents an acre to the Métis and 15 cents an acre to Indians? Pardon me? He wants the entire Northwest Territories assigned a value of 40 cents an acre to be divided up 20 cents an acre to 25 cents an acre to Métis and 15 cents an acre to Indians. That sounds racist. In fact, that's gotta be racist. But you know, basically, generally he's out for money. But then Macdonald finally gets the drift that what he's Riel's after the second time is money for himself. Now Riel doesn't tell this to his followers. He pitches his return to his followers in this, that he wants to get terms out of the Canadian government for them. So he pitches himself as altruistic to his followers, that he was not to be bought, but privately he was communicating with the contacts that the government had and asking for money, and a lot of money. Yet his private manner, his grievances carefully enumerated. This is Creigton, page 395. So there's two things going on simultaneously here. This is 1884. Not sure about that, but we've got the Second Riel Rebellion brewing, and we've got the CPR final stages, or it is trying to be built in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, northern Ontario. These two things are going on simultaneously. So there's two massive challenges that Macdonald and his government have simultaneously, and they are interreacting with each other. Now, of course, the CPR is perennially going to go bust. This is the challenge, not just the physical challenge of building the railway over the mountain passes in British Columbia, but it's the money. The crews strike at several points because they don't get paid, and George Stephen is having a nervous breakdown. Macdonald is at the head of it all. So these guys are all Scottish Canadians. Macdonald, Stephen, and Donald Smith. And apparently they're all from the same small area in Scotland. Their families were. And there's a famous rock in Scotland, I believe in this area, called Craiglachie. And anybody who's driven, across the Trans-Canada, across the mountains, you might have seen the sign for Craiglachie, where the last spike was driven, and that is named by, Donald Smith or George Stephen Cable's. This is the method of communication at the time. Basically, they're basically bust. There's revolt by the workers. The Métis are grabbing their guns. There's a famous cable that just says 3 words: "Stand fast, Craiglachie." Now, Craiglachie was a rock in Scotland that had some history in Scottish history as a rallying point for fighting the dastardly English, probably, or possibly other clans. But this is a famous telegram at the height of the crisis: "Stand fast, Craiglachie." So we'll get some quotes here. Wow, this is the contacts are made with Riel, and the shocking realization occurs to Macdonald that Riel is just out for money. And this, I think, ticks him off. So this is quoting from Creigton. His claims, McDowell went on, this is the contact with Riel, amount to the modest sum of $100,000. I don't know what that would mean in 1884 money, what that would mean now. It's probably a gigantic fortune. But he will take $35,000 as originally offered, and I believe myself $3,000 to $5,000 would cart the whole Riel family across the border. Riel made it distinctly understood that, quote, self was his main object, and he was willing to make the claims of his followers totally subservient to his own interests. Cynically candid about his real purposes, he was equally plain-spoken about the kind of assurances he would accept. Verbal or written promises would have no effect upon him whatsoever. Hard cash would alone induce him to play his part. He said, quote, my name is Riel and I want material, which I suppose McDowell added a little salary was a pun. To Macdonald, it was a shattering revelation. It made the whole agitation seem a malevolent sham. I didn't know this about Riel originally. Now, there's probably lots of debate about Riel. And maybe this isn't all the details, and we're getting, of course, the Toronto perspective here. And we're not saying anything about the Métis themselves or the Cree, but Riel himself. This is certainly primary source information that's pretty important, both in what we think of Riel and what we think of Macdonald's response and the Canadian government's response to the Second Riel Rebellion. And the fate of Riel, which we will get into. So they're trying to keep this CPR going. You've got George Stevens got an ingenious financial wizardry. So it was, with minor modifications, the plan which Macdonald had discussed with Tupper and Stephen during the previous autumn. In place of the 35 millions of dormant common stock which were to be cancelled by the proposed legislation, the CPR was empowered to issue an equivalent amount of fixed mortgage bonds. The essence of the plan was that the existing government lien upon the whole of the company's property was to be extinguished by the new bonds. They were to be delivered to government and retained by government as a security both for the loan of the previous year and for a new advance of $5 million, which was to be made immediately to the company. Tupper thought the plan excellent. He expected little opposition in Parliament or the country, especially with the fact before them that but for the rapid construction of the CPR, the country might have been torn to pieces, enormous waste of blood and treasure. So what happened? Well, Van Horn, who is the famous, boss out on the construction of the CPR, I think he was later Sir Van Horn, or he was knighted or something for what he did. But Van Horn telegraphs to Stephen, pay car can't be sent out, and unless we get immediate relief, we must stop. Please inform Prime Minister and Finance Minister. Do not be surprised or blame me if an immediate and most serious catastrophe happens. So they're trying to stay alive. But would the Canadian people be willing to pay the price of their own national survival? The party was now committed, but the measure of relief had still to be pushed through the recalcitrant and ungovernable House of Commons, and the whole management of the government's program fell on Macdonald. For day after day of furious battle, Macdonald, the solitary fighting member of the cabinet, faced the House virtually alone. He had every reason to break down. His record for the past few years must have led everybody, including himself, to expect a collapse. but fed with some mysterious inner source of strength, he stood his ground. I am holding out pretty well, he told his sister early in May, in the hard fight we have here. He's afraid of his French-Canadian MPs leaving the caucus. But I'm going to just sort of summarize here in that what happened was that the CPR ended up getting operational from central Canada to Manitoba just in time for the Canadian government to ship troops out. The Second Riel Rebellion broke out. There was armed conflict. And this was the first war experience, the first saying goodbye to the troops in Canadian history. And we don't know anything. Nobody knows anything about this today. But it's wonderfully related in Pierre Burton's The Last Spike. I think I'm going to review The Last Spike, referring to the CPR, obviously. But Burton tells the story really fascinatingly. And Creigton has a little bit of it too. But this was the first war experience in central Canada, after Confederation. When the country was a country itself. And, troops were shipped from all the provinces, the Maritimes, Quebec, Central Canada, or Ontario, were raised and shipped via the CPR to the West. And this put down the Second Riel Rebellion. So what this had the effect of is a success on both of the main problems, that because the CPR was being used to ship troops out west, the government was able to push through a bill to keep it alive financially and to complete construction, and it simultaneously made the west part of Canada for real. These whole two intertwined events. This is a big deal, and I will relate that, and I hereby promise that I'm going to review Burton's wonderful book where he tells that story really amazingly. People saying goodbye to their sons at the train, this kind of thing we're more familiar with from World War I and World War II. But the Second Riel Rebellion was the first time that happened in Canada. And I have to say, Canadians do not know anything about that, about our own history. For good and ill, you can have different perspectives on the Second Riel Rebellion, but this is Canadian history, and it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So Riel is captured, and he's kept in the jail at Regina and awaiting trial. Now, in all this furor, there's this fight between the federal government and the provinces. And Macdonald gets through a bill called the Franchise Bill. Why am I talking about this? Macdonald has this quote here in 1885. He says, "I consider the passage of the Franchise Bill the greatest triumph of my life," unquote. Like the first Prime Minister of Canada, the leader of the Liberal Conservative Party for 30 years or however long it was, welds together a country from the Atlantic to the Pacific, all this stuff. And he says, "I consider the passage of the Franchise Bill the greatest triumph of my life." So this is interesting, and we have to take Macdonald on his own terms. He was primarily a lawyer. We have to remember this. He's a small town lawyer. I guess you could call Kingston small, not small town, small city lawyer. And this bill was an attempt to standardize voting across the different provinces, because before Confederation, each colony would have had its control over its own elections. But after Confederation, I think they tried to hold on to this power so that they could probably manipulate elections. But um, Macdonald gets through the franchise bill, and he calls this the greatest triumph of my life. So he was a lawyer. He cared about the intricacies of Parliament, and this is what he found interesting. Um, as for a lot of the other stuff, maybe he this responsibility was thrust on him and he didn't really even want it. It's not who he was, but he did it anyways for reasons. Why? Why? Because he loved Canada? Because he loved the British Empire? Considered his responsibility, perhaps? But hopefully, the viewers are getting a sense of who Macdonald was, and as Creigton relates him. So Riel is tried and convicted of treason and sentenced to be executed. So now I'll just summarize, but the lawyers for Riel were apparently some of the best lawyers in Canada. Whether they were in his true best interest, I'd have to look into the details of that. But basically, they went for an insanity plea. But Riel's communications about I want money and all this, and then he himself attempted to disagree with his lawyers that no, I'm not insane, and I never was insane. And so basically, the defense was unsuccessful, and he was convicted and sentenced to be executed. Now there was a huge uproar in Quebec, and this is where we get one of the most famous quotes of Sir John Macdonald. Riel will hang if every dog in Quebec barks in his favor. So Macdonald puts his foot down, and he is infamously known for this, for the execution of Riel. But just as much, he's probably hated not only in Western Canada. Well, this is a myth in Western Canada. Abuse by the federal government, and associated with Sir John A. Macdonald in particular, but also in Quebec. So it was because Riel was Catholic. So there's an enormous meeting, but it went back and forth. The Quebec members of Macdonald's cabinet tried to, they wanted an appeal. And so it was appealed. Now, there was no Supreme Court yet, I don't think. So this was appealed to the British Privy Council, the Judicial Council of the Privy Council in London. But they upheld the verdict. And then even after that, there was sort of a round three that Macdonald's did not want to agree to, but he had to, or he decided to allow a panel of medical men to travel back to Regina and submit a report on Riel's current mental state, because Riel had messianic or um, delusions of grandeur in any case. Um, the and this commission was sent over to see whether, not that his sentence could be completely, you know, the execution could be rescinded, but that it could be stayed, as they were in the purpose of the commission was to see whether he was insane at that time, not when he committed the act that was he was tried for of treason, but whether he was sane at that time so that his sentence could be postponed. But the doctors came back and said that it was not in their opinion that he was legal. There was a legal definition of what was of unsound mind, or however, it was probably a very 19th century conception, mind you. So, but the third, step or contingency came back negative, and Macdonald said, no, he's going to be hung. So, Creigton describes this. Riel is hung in Regina, and that event has never. It continues to this day. There was a huge mass meeting on the Champ de Mars at Montreal denouncing, quote, the hangman's government in Ottawa. Wilfrid Laurier said if he had lived on the Saskatchewan, he would have shouldered a musket. The huge meeting resulted in the formation of Le Parti National, the fear of Canadian political life, a purely racial French-Canadian political party. So is this the beginnings of Quebec nationalism? I can say the beginnings. I mean, it's been around for centuries, but this certainly enters into the mythology of Quebec and the Métis, the French Canadian Métis. So the CPR is completed. Sir John A. takes a trip across Canada, July 10, 1886. He says in a speech in Winnipeg that his view of the CPR does not end at Port Moody, but continues across the Pacific to the Far East. So he visits Crowfoot at Gleason on the Blackfoot Reserve. So we're going to read that. Some interesting details there. Crowfoot, the great Blackfoot chief, who kept the Blackfoot out of the Second Riel Rebellion. We can get into that, but basically the Blackfoot were the eternal enemies of the Cree, and that was probably the major factor. It had nothing to do with it, Canada. It's just that they weren't going to join their traditional enemies, the Cree, in anything. However, Crowfoot, and if they had, there'd have been a much bigger, it would have been a real war. So, because the Blackfoot were still the lords of the, the railways was just built, so there was the Blackfoot were still a force to be reckoned with here. And Crowfoot, all the other chiefs who meet, come to the meeting. Old Sun, Eagle Rib, Medicine Shield, Running Eagle, Little Plume, arrayed fully in war paint and feathers, but Crowfoot wears old clothes to meet Macdonald. And he does this because Poundmaker, who was a Cree chief, but I believe he was raised in a Blackfoot with the Blackfoot, and Poundmaker was killed in I believe in the Second Riel Rebellion, and so Crowfoot wears old clothes in respect for Poundmaker. In memory and for Macdonald of the dead Poundmaker. His face and its well-shaped features and fine lines was shrewd and proud and intelligent. He told the listening Indians, sick, that Macdonald was the, quote, biggest man they had had among them for a long time. He begged Macdonald to banish the fears of the Indians. Then the Indians did a dance and presents were distributed, and Macdonald gave Crowfoot a dark broadcloth suit of silk facings, a proper suit of mourning. So Macdonald, or somebody advising Macdonald, was sensitive to Macdonald or Crowfoot's feeling for Poundmaker, and Macdonald gives him a suit of mourning. That's very interesting. Very interesting details. So Macdonald continues on to Vancouver, goes out to Victoria, Macdonald's pillars remain the same, the East-West trading nation from sea to sea, that is the national policy, and the alliance with Britain, his two pillars. Politically, his alliance with French-Canadian moderates was one of his central pillars of his career and life. So we think Macdonald's finished yet? What hasn't he done? Is there anything left to do? Is he going to build a railway, across the other continents of the world? No, he's not finished yet. Incredibly. I'm going to take a short break here, and then we're going to finish on Macdonald's final election that he fights. So I'm going to race to the finish line. This has been not the smallest two books to review here. And I'm going to charge over the finish line with Sir John A. and his final emphatic election of 1891. So Macdonald is basically embattered, but accomplished things that nobody believed possible. Must have been absolutely hated by his political rivals. But this is not, his life is more era after era of overcoming things. Macdonald started when he was a young man, had tragedies in his life, was out on his own at 15 years of age. His first wife was chronically ill. His first child died. His first wife died. His second daughter had a physical deformity and was mentally challenged. He would go and see his daughter every day, and his daughter was there all this time. His daughter Mary, and his wife. And they died. They didn't have another child. This was his life. And I recall a anecdote that not Crowfoot, but other of the Blackfoot chiefs, like the Blood and the Pagan, went and visited Macdonald in Ottawa at his house. And Macdonald was with his daughter Mary. It's probably a mistake to it's not a list of successes. Macdonald was like a tragic person. He was an imperfect person. He made a ton of mistakes, but he got off the mat, and that's what he was finally known for. He was a fighter, and he proves it. He's 75 years old. So we'll take up Creigton here. He was nearly 75 years old. He faced the world like an old lion, less strong than he had been and conscious of his waning strength, but still powerful and proud of his continued mastery. He was tall and slight, his carriage was erect, he held himself as a young man, and his hair, waving in a fine, thin, silvery cloud, was a not too unsubstantial ghost of the curly chevelure of his young manhood. His eyes were tired and disillusioned, but his mouth was firm with strength and humour, and there was no bitterness, no mere shrewdness, no cunning and small deceptions in his face. His face was wise and deeply experienced and full of battle. He offered no apologies. He suffered no vain regrets. He stood erect and determined, with an air of debonair defiance, of jaunty courage. Craiglachie, you could probably say. He had outlasted a whole political generation. The comrades and antagonists of his young manhood, McNab and Hincks, Cameron and Foley, were all dead. George Brown, the greatest rival of his career, had been 10 years in his grave. Tilley and Campbell and McClellan had all retired into the honourable obscurity of lieutenant governorships, and it was now half a century since the day in the autumn of 1839 when the young Alexander Campbell had first walked into his small office in Kingston. I believe that was his law partner. and he had his law firm going on all this time, where he earned his income from. 19th century politicians weren't paid. They had their own incomes from their own businesses or law practices. He had seen 7 governor generals come and go. He heard from some of them still, though at longer and longer intervals. He was still interested in general ideas rather than in administrative detail. He had a young man's zest for new constructive policies and a young man's impatience with mere competent routines. He says, I told this guy before leaving, he wrote to Thompson this is one of his ministers, I believe, during the summer of 1889, that while all my colleagues diligently attend to their several departments, I cannot get them to consider, or rather to express any opinion on the general policy of the government unless I initiate it. I instance the question of a proposed conference of the Australasian colonies, when I 4 times invited the attention of the council to consider it, but got nothing more than a general acquiescence in whatever I proposed. Now this acquiescence is flattering enough, but it does not help me. So Macdonald's thinking about conferences with Australia and New Zealand. He's a pretty big thinker, okay? And he's pretty rare at any time. Quite the guy, okay? And his other, he can't get his other cabinet ministers to thinking what's going on in their own constituency, and Macdonald had to think about that too. But what is Macdonald calls it? The general policy of the government. He says, I can't get anybody else to think of it unless I initiate it. Macdonald rejected a peerage and an ambassadorship of, I believe, of the British Empire or of the British government at Washington. So he rejected those 2 things. And what's going on in, of course, there was all these major events in the West, but down in the U.S., the Republicans are moving towards protectionism. And on January 14, the Toronto Mail announced on authority which leaves little reason to doubt that the rumor is true that Great Britain has been urging Canada to compose its differences with the United States in a broad trade agreement, quote, and that Sir John Macdonald and his colleagues are seriously disturbed in consequence, unquote. This provoked a counter-declaration from the Toronto Empire. The Mail's statement, it declared roundly, was not true. On the contrary, it was the government of the United States which had recently approached the Canadian government with a view to the improvement of trade relations. So this is the Canadian-American relations is going on at this time. So Macdonald had not changed his program. He did not intend directly to attack Blaine. This is the American Secretary of State. But by good fortune, Farrer, the intermediary between the American Secretary of State and the Canadian opposition, had been delivered into his hands. So there's some relationship between the Liberal opposition and the American Secretary of State, or alleged relationship. On Tuesday, February 17, yes. So this is the election of 1891. I have to get, if communicate this faithfully. Um, Basically, uh, how can I communicate this correctly? On Monday, February 2nd, the order for the general election was signed. This is 1891. When Macdonald drove home that evening with his secretary, Joseph Pope, he seemed full of energy, and far into the night he was busy outlining his election address. The address was a reasoned defence of his design for Canada and of its two greatest foundations, the National Transcontinental Railway and the national policy of protection. It was a reasoned attack upon unrestricted reciprocity, free trade, which in his view offered the most fundamental threat to the fiscal autonomy and political independence of Canada. He is against free trade with the US. The question which you will shortly be called upon to determine, he told the voters, resolves itself into this: shall we endanger our possession of the great heritage bequeathed to us by our fathers, and submit ourselves to direct taxation for the privilege of having our tariff fixed at Washington, with a prospect of ultimately becoming a portion of the American Union? He's saying that free trade is going to mean that the US is in control of Canada. As for myself, my course is clear. So this is upping the stakes on things. He thinks that the national policy means Canadian independence. He thinks that free trade means that Canada is de facto part of the United States, which makes this argument and this issue more current, as this was revisited obviously in the NAFTA agreement in the 1988 election. There was a huge furor over NAFTA then, but this is the first time and Macdonald says that free trade means that the US is basically just going to take over Canada. Now, they'll have to analyze that in a post-NAFTA world, but Home Depot, Walmart, where's the Canadian hardware and department stores? Nobody even thinks about this, but Sir John A. Macdonald is gonna go down firing. A British subject I was born, a British subject I will die, he says. With my utmost effort, with my last breath, will I oppose the veiled treason, quote, which attempts by sordid means and mercenary proffers to lure our people from their allegiance. During my long public service of nearly half a century, I have been true to my country and its best interests, and I appeal with equal confidence to the men who have trusted me in the past and to the young hope of the country with whom rest its destinies for the future, to give me their united and strenuous aid in this, my last effort, for the unity of the empire and the preservation of our commercial and political freedom. Them's is fighting words. It isn't a boring election. This guy's 76 or whatever. 76? Them's is fighting words. So he's getting into calling the Liberals traitors because they want free trade with the US. Pretty strong. But does he go all the way in that? Does he actually do that? Well, I'm going to relate a story from Christopher Pennington's The Destiny of Canada. You can see this. This is a book on the 1891 election specifically. Macdonald, Laurier, and the election of 1891. You can see this, I believe this is probably some kind of campaign poster. Got the grand old man. I believe the election slogan was the old flag, the old man, the old policy, or something like that. And this was the factory worker. There's a factory in the background, and the farm scene in the background. So this was the conception of Canada, portrayed at least by the Conservatives in the 1891 election, when elections still meant something. Big fight brewing. So Liberals didn't like being called traitors, but there was a huge meeting in Toronto, sort of the climax of the election, and Sir John A. spoke at. I'm going to relate this story from Pennington. So, the first indication that Tuesday, February 17, was to be an extraordinary day was a front-page announcement in the Saturday edition of the Toronto Empire. You can see here. Not much of a resolution here, but we've got, it says, the Premier, accompanied by Sir Charles Tupper, will speak in Toronto. A monster Conservative rally was planned in the city on Tuesday evening, and that was not all. There was thrilling, mysterious news. Sir John would not just be giving his usual stump speech. Instead, the Empire hinted, he would reveal damning evidence of a treasonous Liberal conspiracy. What evidence? What conspiracy? There were no further details other than the time of the rally, 6 o'clock, and the location, the Toronto Academy of Music. So this is a memorable night at the Toronto Academy of Music, February 17, 1891. The exact nature of the old man's accusation was left to the fertile imaginations of the newspaper's readers. There was an excited stir in the Queen City over the next 3 days. The Empire plus the World and News, the lesser Tory-leaning papers, did their best to build suspense and tease readers with hints of intrigue and scandal. I don't know where the facts exactly fell in the newspapers. But I mean, have things changed that much? I think the papers, we'll get into the papers another time. But on Monday, the day before the meeting, Macdonald and Tupper arrived together aboard a CPR Express and checked promptly into the Queen's Hotel. Its interior was elegant and extravagant, and the south-facing upper windows boasted a magnificent view beyond Union Station to the lapping waves of Lake Ontario. In its most infamous room, the Red Parlour, the Prime Minister had convened many secret meetings, brokered many deals, and collected vast campaign contributions, some legal and some not probably, over the years. On Tuesday morning, the day of the rally, he and Tupper held court for several hours, turning the hotel into what the Toronto World described as, quote, the mecca of scores of Conservative workers from all parts of the province, unquote. In the afternoon, Sir John retired to his room to rest. He had a big night ahead. 7 o'clock arrived. There was a great shout. So it's already an hour after the meeting was supposed to be convened. There was a great shout, and an enormous surge to the front. Wait a second, did I skip ahead here? No. Then an enormous surge to the front. The crowd charged through the front door. This is of the Academy of Music, where much as a fast-flowing current might squeeze through narrow riverbanks, and within seconds the theatre was filled. Not for another 20 minutes did the organizers manage to push the front doors shut. About 4,000 people were crammed inside, far beyond the hall's normal capacity, and still, by the excited estimate of the Empire at least, 15 or 20,000 people hoped to get in, blocking carriage and streetcar traffic from York to Simcoe Street. There was a sign of frustration and impending trouble. A large gas lamp outside the hall was carried away by criminals, rupturing the gas main beneath it. The lamps inside were rendered unusable, and the organizers were forced to throw the switch on the relatively untested electrical lighting for the rest of the evening. The atmosphere inside was exciting and expected. The seats were filled, of course, and many people had been stuffed into the aisles, the limited standing room at the rear and sides, and even the window embrasures. Some seats had been ripped off their moorings, and the blue plush railings at the back of the theatre had been badly muddied by dirty feet. Window panes had been smashed, door fastenings had been broken. 300 leading conservatives were assembling on the stage, and not everybody, it appeared, was friendly to their cause. The reporter from the News spotted one bald, grey-whiskered gentleman making himself particularly obnoxious, having, quote, made it his special business to shout in drunken tones at the members of the committee who were arranging the people on the platform, unquote. An unruly pack of young men, somewhat out of control, dominated the orchestra pit. A contingent of young Tories hustled about, frantically trying to maintain order. All of the reporters observed that hundreds of ladies were in attendance. This is, I'm just reading here. I'm just reading someone else's writing here. Several who remained trapped in the throng outside had actually fainted, leading the News to state the next day rather piggishly, okay, so Pennington redeems himself here, that, quote, many a woman learned what it is to take an active part in politics, unquote. It apparently means attending a giant brawl. But the dresses of those seated inside lent welcome color to an audience that was otherwise a sea of dark suits and hats. The decorating committee, always important at these events, had spared no expense. All pillars and boxes bore signs inscribed with patriotic mottos such as God Save the Queen and Disloyalty is at a discount. Disloyalty is at a discount. Behind the stage hung huge banners reading Hail to our Chieftain, and in a special dig at these politicians, opposition politicians, or it says, no United States senators need apply. Each banner depicted 3 shields across its center, one for each of the old flag, the old leader, and the old policy. Along the balcony ran a sign that summed up the theme of the evening. Ottawa, not Washington, our capital, it defiantly read. Canada for the Canadians. Just past 7:30, the Prime Minister's horse-drawn carriage finally came into view. It was a remarkable achievement that the carriage even got as far as the Academy before it was completely hemmed in. Inside sat a calm Macdonald and 4 others. There's people pressing around the carriage. Inside sat a calm Macdonald and 4 others, Harry Brock, a local party man who would introduce the Prime Minister, Colonel Fred Denison, provincial MPP and brother of George Denison, the police magistrate and president of the Imperial Federation League, and 2 very fortunate young members of the Young Men's Liberal Conservative Club of Toronto. None of them, for the moment at least, was going anywhere. Appeals were made to the crowd to make way for the Prime Minister. Instead, there were cries for him to make a speech. I love the irreverence of people. That's hilarious. 10 long claustrophobic minutes passed, during which Macdonald and his entourage were trapped in the carriage. Eventually, Harry Brock, showing some dash, took matters into his own hands. He stepped out and, with the assistance of the police, formed a wedge that managed to shepherd the Prime Minister, not without some uncomfortable bumping and jostling, through the cheering crowd and into the theatre. Denison and the 2 young Conservatives were not quick enough, however, and had to remain sitting helplessly in their carriage as the crowd again closed ranks around it. There was a thunderous ovation when Macdonald entered the theatre. It sustained itself for several minutes as he was slowly ushered to the stage, and as he moved forward he smiled and bowed several times to acknowledge the cheers. As the Empire fervently described the occasion, quote, whirlwind after whirlwind of applause and cheers shook the building. Hats, handkerchiefs, flags were waved in indescribable enthusiasm. When he stepped onto the platform, the audience burst spontaneously into a rendition of For He's a Jolly Good Fellow, accompanied by a booming drum that someone had brought. And 10 minutes passed before the serenade petered out. All along, Macdonald smiled and remained quiet, seated prominently among the luminaries on the stage. So Sir Charles Tupper is supposed to give the opening speech, but he can't get into the theater. When Tupper finally stepped onto the stage, there was practical pandemonium. So much commotion was made, in fact, that Tupper could not begin for his speech for several minutes. He attempted several times to get underway, but the clamor was too great. He urged the crowd to think of the reputation of Toronto for hearing a man out. He joked that they ought to adopt, quote, a little unrestricted reciprocity in the way of order. There's a pun on the Liberals' policy. Finally, Tupper sat down in frustration. He stayed there for a few minutes until the police were able to physically eject some of the leading troublemakers. As the fracas went on, Sir John remained seated, still smiling, but with a look of mild annoyance on his face. When things at last settled down, Harry Brock reintroduced Tupper, the most eloquent man on the continent of America, and Sir Charles delivered one of his classic bludgeoning speeches. He touted the national policy in the CPR and bashed the Liberals, who had been too short-sighted to support them. He singled out Sir Richard Cartwright, sarcastically observing that he was a man of marked ability and unquestionable courage, so that the audience could shout back, "But he is no good." He asked them what unrestricted reciprocity, which was the same thing as commercial union, really meant. "Annexation," the crowd replied. "And where had it come from? The head, the leader, and the front of commercial union is Mr. Erasmus Wyman," Tupper intoned. The crowd hissed. "Mr. Erasmus Wyman is a very clever man," he continued, "and he has labored night and day for years for the purpose of undermining the loyalty and integrity of Canada. It is not disguised." Sir Charles then claimed that in a recent speech Wyman had given in the United States, the, quote, dictator from New York had declared, "I have got some young Canadian statesmen on the Liberal side that I can mold like putty." The audience laughed, so Wyman must have been an American politician. "I have got some young Canadian statesmen on the Liberal side that I can mold like putty," the audience laughed, "and I can make them do just what I want." Tupper kept hammering at Wyman for some time. Perhaps, he admitted, Wyman had enslaved Sir Richard Cartwright and John Charlton, but Conservatives, even most sensible Liberals, would never fall for his attempts to break down this glorious Canada of ours from its high, exalted, and noble position to one of serfdom to the United States. This is hyperbole, political rhetoric at its finest. At last the warhorse of Cumberland, that's what they called Tupper, sat down, to a generous ovation mixed with a few errant catcalls, and the great moment arrived. Harry Brock made a brief introduction, and when Macdonald leaned forward from his chair, the place went wild. Hats, handkerchiefs, walking sticks, umbrellas, and programs were waved in the air, and hoarse cheering throughout the hall blended into a deafening roar. Sir John stood silently, his eyes perhaps glistening a little, his mouth turned slightly upward in an appreciative smile. At one point the cheers faded somewhat, only to have someone shout, "For he's a jolly good fellow." The whole audience broke into the song, the ladies' voices soaring clearly above the din. When that died down, Sir John seemed ready to speak, but a member of Parliament from Toronto, George Ferguson, left from his seat and pinned a buttonhole bouquet on the PM's label. Into his arms Ferguson placed a heap of lilies, orchids, and chrysanthemums. And there Sir John stood, laden with flowers, as he finally began to address the crowd. At first the people were somewhat startled. Sir John was dressed sharply, wearing a bold red tie and cameo pin, but he looked distressingly frail and sounded even worse. He could not be heard beyond the first few rows. "Mr. Chairman, ladies, gentlemen," he started softly, "I need scarcely hope that my feeble and aged voice will reach to the extremities of this hall." As everyone strained to hear, he complimented Sir Charles on a fine speech. He then said, "It is always a great pleasure for me to come to Toronto," and the hometown crowd burst into proud and relieved applause. He dwelled on Toronto for a while, musing that it was here that the effects of the national policy had been most pronounced. "Every time I visit it," he said grandly, "I see palaces springing up. I see magnificent edifices devoted to Canadian industry." He was now speaking with more force. "I see evidences of wealth and prosperity. Look at the villages and towns of Ontario. The hamlets have grown up to be villages, and the villages to be towns, and the towns are now aspiring to be cities, all through the action of the national policy. That drew fervent cheers. I would want no greater praise than that there should be engraved on my tombstone, he continued, making a heartstring tugging allusion to his fading strength, that I introduced and carried into Parliament the national policy, giving protection to native industries and making the country prosperous. It was not the whole truth, not to an impartial observer at least. The national policy had not been such a resounding success, but this was no time for splitting hairs. And anyway, there was few impartial observers inside the theatre, that's for sure. Macdonald praised the Canadian Pacific Railway, the greatest accomplishment of his party, for opening up the country. He now pledged to subsidize the construction of a line of fast steamships that could carry Canadian goods across the Pacific to China and Japan. That was an eye-popper of a promise, sure to cost millions, but was predictably well received by the crowd, which seems to have been Macdonald's intention here. These new trade links would insulate Canada against any trade slowdown caused by the petulant behavior of the Americans, should they choose to maintain their ludicrous McKinley tariff. Then there was, most importantly, the British connection. Canadians had always been able to rely on the British market, and they could still do so. Under his watch there would be no weakening of trade relations with the mother country, no tariff discrimination against Great Britain, and the Liberals were shamefully proposing. Macdonald was edging towards the main thrust of his speech. Objective and impartial speech. Now the crowd was quiet as he spoke. Sir John explained the circumstances of the dissolution of Parliament, reminding his audience that it was James Blaine, not himself, who had been wrong. Then, addressing the thousands of supporters in the theatre and the hundreds of thousands who would read his words the next day in the papers, the Prime Minister launched his extraordinary accusation against the Liberal Party case. This is what the 1891 election became infamous for, and he's about to announce it. He'd been keeping it in his back pocket the whole election for maximum effect. Canadian traitors, as Sir Charles Tupper has truly called them, have gone to Washington, have told them, you should not concede to Canada anything. If you do not put the screws to Canada, if you do not put every possible obstruction upon her trade, if you do not coerce them, bulldoze them in every possible way, you will not get Canada. We will assist you, and with our assistance you will get Canada. That is a very strong statement for me to make, but I make it. I now take the opportunity of making the charge. I say that there is a deliberate conspiracy in which some of the leaders of the opposition are more or less compromised. I say there is a deliberate conspiracy by force, by fraud, or by both to force Canada into the American Union. This is a major charge he's making here. Probably unprecedented. There it was, the charge upon which Sir John had decided to stake the election. Now was the moment for elaboration. First, he wondered, had anyone ever heard of an opposition agent meeting secretly with the leaders of a foreign power, advising them against the interests of Canada's elected government? Never, cried the audience. Name him! Yes, Macdonald replied, I will name him. The audience waited expectantly. In the first place, he asked, you know Mr. Ferrer? Hear, hear. People know who Mr. Ferrer is. He was once the editor of the Mail, when it was a Tory paper. Sir John was getting to the best part. He is now the editor, philosopher, and friend of Sir Richard Cartwright, and the controlling influence of that vast, that glorious and consistent newspaper, the Globe. Mr. Ferrer, Macdonald continued, building the suspense, had been down to Washington several times. Perhaps he is there tonight. Someone called out from the crowd, he is here tonight. It was true. Ferrer had strolled by the great throng on King Street earlier, seen by countless people, and stopped with John Willison to watch what was unfolding. The Empire reporter since spotted them in the hall together. Ferrer was sitting with Willison, nonplussed, watching calmly as the Prime Minister brought the crowd to a fever pitch by accusing him of committing treason. I'm very glad that he is, Macdonald answered, not missing a beat, because he will hear what I have to say. The Prime Minister connected the dots between Ferrer and Sir Richard Cartwright. portraying the latter and not Wilfrid Laurier as the driving force behind the madness that had overtaken the Liberal Party. Already had drawn laughs for referring to Cartwright as Mr. Richard, accidentally, then joking, "I do not think he can, in any decency, keep the title he got from the Queen when he becomes Senator for Ontario." His conduct, however, had been no laughing matter. Macdonald accused Cartwright of having sneaked down to Washington, sneaked down, coaxed by Wyman, then skulking about, inquiring about whether he could not sell Canada and sell me. The audience guffawed at that ridiculous thought. What was the evidence of his sinister intent? Macdonald explains that Edward Ferrer, the conscience keeper of Sir Richard Cartwright, had written a pamphlet for his anonymous American friends, explaining what measures the United States should take to force Canada into annexation. A loyal man with knowledge of the pamphlet had brought it to the attention of the government. He had obtained galley proofs of certain pages, and the police were now searching for the rest. "Hear, hear," shouted the crowd. "I will read to you the last paragraph of that paper," Macdonald continued, building up to the critical moment, "and you will see the charge that I make, that all this negotiation at Washington is merely leading up to a result which they consider inevitable, the annexation of Canada to the United States." "Hear, hear." Sir John slid his hand into his breast pocket, came out brandishing the proofs, the evidence itself, and from it he read aloud about the punitive measures that the United States could use to bring Canadian business to its knees and thus soften up the country for annexation. There were also disparaging remarks about the Canadian political system. Ferrer described it, and by extension the people in the country, as corrupt, pathetic, and held together only by the cleverness of the Prime Minister. "The writer pays me a great compliment," Macdonald said. "Says annexation cannot make great progress as long as I am at the head of affairs." That triggered more cheers. "But then," he says, Sir John grinned, "I am 75 years old." He corrected Farr, "I am 76 years old." There was more laughter. "Joking aside," Sir John intoned, Ferrer had written, "it is plain that Sir John's disappearance from the stage is to be the signal for a movement towards annexation. A leader will be forthcoming when the hour arrives." Shouts from the crowd. "That's Cartwright." Indeed it was, Sir John acknowledged. He was building towards his conclusion, carrying everyone in the room with him. "I believe that this election," he said earnestly, "which is a great crisis, and upon which so much depends, will show the Americans that we prize our country as much as they do, that we would fight for our existence as much as they fought for the preservation of their independence." Hear, hear. There was one final poignant line from the old man. It reflected his hope, his enduring belief. Quote, "that the spirit of our fathers, which fought and won battle after battle, still exists in their sons, and if I thought it otherwise I would say the sooner the grass was growing over my grave the better, rather than that I should see the degradation of the country which I have loved so much, which I have served so long." Unquote. Macdonald sat down. He had given the last great speech of his life. The crowd exploded in raucous cheers, and from the platform the Conservative leaders around led the crowd in a chorus of improvised song. "We will hang Ned Ferrer on a sour apple tree." A thunderous rendition of "God Save the Queen" followed, and the meeting was officially concluded. Sir John lingered on the platform for a while, shaking hands, receiving congratulations, and waiting for the crowd to thin out before riding back with Joseph Pope to the Queen's Hotel. Tomorrow there would be a speech to deliver, and another the day after that. There would be days of travel and constant demands from the party upon his precious time, away from Agnes and Mary and Earnscliffe, his house in Ottawa, where he needed to rest. But tonight, for a moment, Macdonald could pause and savor what the Empire correctly regarded in its morning edition as, quote, "the greatest political meeting ever held in Canada," unquote. So, Macdonald goes out with a bang. Defiant nationalism. And it wasn't just rhetoric, because the national policy was real. It was tariff. And he believed in building an East-West Canadian economy. And that free trade with the US was annexation. I wonder what you would think of the Canada today. I mean, just in an economic sense, vis-a-vis the US. We'll limit it to that. But I'm going to skip ahead on the final chapter of Macdonald's life. Basically, the 1891 election basically killed him because he collapsed at a speech, or after a speech. He went to Kingston after this giant meeting in Toronto, and he had a meeting at Kingston, or in his original small town just near Kingston. And then afterwards he collapsed, and he never really recovered from that collapse after the meeting near Kingston. They won the election. He attended a few cabinet meetings or caucus meetings in Ottawa, but he had some serious relapses of serious conditions. I believe had a paralysis, and well, we'll finish Creigton here. He died on Saturday, June 6th. So, a great meeting in Toronto was on it was February, wasn't it? February 17th, 1891. And he died on June 6th, 1891. So he was literally fighting an election, and he was prime minister right up until the day he died. So I will just relate a few, detail Creigton's note on authorities. His focus on primary sources is one of Creigton's most distinguishing characteristics as a historian. And he says, the evidence for the last 24 years of Macdonald's career is in fact extremely large in quantity and high in quality. Most of this material has been used very little in the past, writing in 1955, and a substantial portion of it here used for the first time. The Macdonald Papers, capital P, which continue to be the most important single source for the biography, that's important to note, are much more voluminous for the post-Confederation than for the pre-Confederation period. They are supplemented by valuable collections of the papers of Macdonald's principal colleagues, of which the Tupper Papers and the Thompson Papers at the Public Archives of Canada and the Alexander Campbell Papers, I believe that was his law partner, at the Public Records and Archives of Ontario have been the most useful. The domestic side of Macdonald's life is illuminated by a diary of Lady Macdonald in the possession of Mrs. D. F. Pepler, which covers the early post-Confederation years and the political gossip of Ottawa as it came to the attention of an informed and responsible civil servant, is revealed in the diary of Edmund A. Meredith. So, Lady Macdonald, like Agnes Macdonald's diary. And then there's another, the political gossip of Ottawa is also is related in a second diary of Edmund A. Meredith. Okay, this guy's diary is civil servant in Ottawa is also primary source. The papers of the governor-generals and the colonial secretaries of the period have provided some of the richest sources of material for the old chieftain. Macdonald was accustomed to write regularly and frequently to his political chiefs in much the same way as Disraeli and Gladstone reported to Queen Victoria. That's significant and interesting. So I'm going to give a critical summary of Creigton in these two volumes, and because this is Creigton's Macdonald, okay. We can get into other people's perspectives on Macdonald. I'm primarily relating Creigton's Macdonald, Creigton as detailed in his biography. So Creigton's scholarship, Creigton's biography. It's difficult to criticize historical writings such as Creigton's biographies of Macdonald because the narrative is primarily a relation of primary source information. Newspaper accounts of events, excerpts from letters, speeches, diaries. So I just asked the question that people can think about this. Is it the role of historians primarily to tell us about their subject, here John A. Macdonald, or tell us what they think about the subject, that is, about their own opinions, that is, themselves, not the subject? So is it the role of historians to tell us about their subject, or is it the role of the historian to tell us about their own opinions of the subject? I say the former, and Creigton sticks to that. Now he can be criticized in other ways, but there's no doubt that this is primarily telling us about Macdonald in his own words from his own perspective based on primary source information, letters, speeches, etc. This is Creigton's historical writing. Now, having said that, Nathan Manning, I personally want to know about Macdonald. Okay? Not some 21st century person's opinions. Okay? I can, why? Because Macdonald accomplished more. I want to first learn about Macdonald in his own terms. Creigton does a good job of that, in my opinion. Now, I'll be critical of Creigton in other respects, but as for telling me who Macdonald was in his own words, from Macdonald's own perspective, I think Creigton's scholarship is exemplary historical writing. So does Creigton not question Macdonald enough? So this is fair criticism of Creigton. My response to that question is I can criticize Macdonald. What I want first is just information, and Creigton gives me that information. So even on that, I'd say, does Creigton not relate enough negative details or critical details of Sir John A. Macdonald? I can form my opinion on, say, a second party in a situation, a different point of view than Macdonald's. I can come up with that opinion myself. I don't need the historian to do that for me, in my opinion. People can have their own opinions on this. I don't want a historian to tell me what to think, indoctrinate me. Having concluded this about Creigton's work, so having said all that, I give Creigton what's the point in a reviewer giving an accomplished professor like Creigton a grade? I don't think that's my role. In reviewing his work, I find he sticks to the primary sources. I'll just say that. It's in fact just compendium, a compilation of primary source material. And that's what I think historical writing should be. Now, me, Nathan Manning, I have my own interests. I find Western Canadian Indigenous history particularly interesting. I've read my own interests for many years, decades of primary source accounts of fur traders and um, explorers and you know, Indigenous history in the prairie provinces is a hobby of mine, and I would like more of information from the perspective of Western Canada, from the perspective of Indigenous people in Western Canada. I personally would like a lot more in that. But the question is, did Macdonald think about that? And just first of all, on a factual basis, no, he did not. Why? Because he was a basically 18th century politician from Kingston. He never even traveled to Western Canada until when, 1880, whenever after the construction of the railway. Now, he claimed sovereignty over this country. So can he be criticized for claiming sovereignty over something that he didn't know anything about? That's a fair criticism. And this has been a perspective of Western Canadians throughout all of Canadian history, and Indigenous people all the more. Who are these guys from heaven? We don't even know where. But we have to remember that this is the perspective of Western Canadians. This is the perspective of Indigenous people. This is a biography of Sir John A. Macdonald. And Creigton tells us who he was. And he does it well. John A. Macdonald can be criticized from a Western Canadian and particularly Western Canadian Indigenous perspective. But first we have to know who Macdonald was from his own perspective, in his own terms. And it's the role of a historian to be empathetic, not to just come in and judge somebody or look at them through their eyes. The role of this historian is to be empathetic and to just tell the reader who this person was from their own perspective. Creigton does a good job of that. Yeah, so then in future, when a historian writes about the reader, somebody writes about me, somebody writes about you in the future, do you want them to just look at you and through the perspective of some person in the future? Or do you want them to take you on your own terms and just tell people in the future who you were? I'd like the latter. As for Macdonald, Creigton tells us a lot about him in his biographies, and I enjoyed learning about Macdonald from Creigton. So there's the old chieftain, and we will never in Canada John A. Macdonald will never die in Canadian history. Depending on your perspective on a particular issue, for good or for bad. And those are discussions for other books I will review. And I look forward to getting into those because Western Canadian history and Canadian history, as you can tell, are interests of mine, not my own only interests. I'll be reviewing other books, but there's Creigton's Macdonald. And till next time. On the Non-Philistine Review.